There we go. Okay. Yes, the pixel force should be fine. We also do still have the cameras here too if you're local. But okay, so if you guys go to D2L for me real quick, in those in-class files, you guys want to give this color correction and stabilization file right here a good old download and extract. Those are what we're going to be using in class today. And then once you get those all nice and downloaded, just give me a thumbs up or an I'm ready in the chat. Those of you I can physically see, you can just give me a physical hand raise. Ooh. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Alex. Okay. Okay, ready? Thanks, Kyle. And then once you get those downloaded, go ahead and open up Premiere. I've already got mine all nice and open. And then go ahead and import or drag and drop all the footage that's inside of that little folder into your Premiere. Oh, good. Alrighty. So like I said, we're going to be doing some color correction inside of Premiere today. Everything that we do today, you can also do the same thing in After Effects. They're called the same things. They're just set up in a different spot. So currently, we're going to go down here to Effects. All of the effects that we'll be using are going to be right here in After Effects. They'll be over here on this right side. So let's go ahead and pick one of these clips. There's two, I think, that have a truck in it. One that's got the ETSU sign with some flowers. And then there's this girl that's getting painted. I'm going to use her. Feel free to drag any of those that you want into the composition to be used. And then find a nice frame that we're going to use as kind of our base to figure out what we want to do color correction wise. So when we're filming, we'll go into it, like I said, a little bit more on Monday, but when we film, we want to use something that's called neutral or cine style to film. So when we got this film here, this footage, you can see that the colors are really flat. Everything's just really neutral. There's not any high contrast or anything like that. We do that on purpose so that we can fully customize how we've color corrected. That way, if we wanted to have a high contrast or low saturation, high saturation, low contrast, we'd have complete control over everything. So this also works very similar to how you would do any kind of color corrections out of Photoshop. You've got your levels, hue and saturation, and here it's called HLS. There's also a whole bunch of other tools that we'll take a look at. So the first one, let's type in, is levels. So in here, there's like an adjustment, there's levels, there's also obsolete auto levels. Anytime you see anything in the obsolete, it just means that Adobe has decided it's no longer going to be having it, and then it will be removed in the next or in the next few updates. So we're going to use just this normal levels. I'm just going to drag it and drop it onto my footage. So over here in my timeline, I'm just going to drop that. And you'll see I have my motion, my opacity, my time remapping, and then my levels. Anytime you're working with an effect here, you can toggle it off and on just by clicking this little effects word right here. But it's pretty self-explanatory. You have your RGB overall red, green, blue channels. You've got your red, your greens, your blues, and then your gammas for each one. So just by changing and lifting these colors here a little bit, you can see we're getting different results. So if I add a little bit more red input, it changes things. Add a little bit more green input, changes things. And what we want to do is just slightly change these numbers just enough to get it as realistic and color corrected as we need it to be. So that might be removing one color, adding another, till we get the colors that we're looking for. Might also mean changing any gamma. So you can see I made it a lot brighter in the blue channel. And we just want to play with these till we get the look that we're looking for. So I'm going to turn this one off. I'm going to come back down here. And if I type in hue, nothing comes up. But if we type in that HLS, they have renamed my stuff. I'm going to go into video effects, color correction here. These are all the color correction ones. We want this color balance, HLS. Drag that one on. This one works the exact way you think. We have our hue, our lightness, and our saturation. This one's pretty much the exact thing that Photoshop uses. You can add a bit of lightness, darkness, up your saturation, make it look all crunchy colors. So I turn that back on and up my saturation. You'll see I get a little bit more color in here. We also have our tint. Tint is really nice. What tint does is says, hey, I have a white value and a black value. So you want to find your brightest point in your image. So mine would be like up here on her cheek. And then you want to find your darkest part of footage, which is probably back here. And what it does is it maps your colors to these as a black and white channel. This is really nice for checking your grayscales. Next, if we come up here to color, so we've got learning, assembly, editing, color, effects, audio, graphics, libraries. If we come over here to color, we have this Lumetri color. This is pretty much the standard Lumetri overall color correction. It's pretty comprehensive and has pretty much any color correction tool inside it that we could ever possibly want. So I'm going to click on this basic correction here. It's this little top section. You can toggle it off and on with these little arrows. check marks. And how it works is it says, hey, I want to use these different types of channels to change how this image looks. So our temperature is whether or not our light is cooler or warmer. So if you do, for some reason, accidentally forget to change your footage to be a nice matching. So if you're filming in tungsten, if you forget to change it to tungsten, your camera won't automatically change the light source. So it'll either be super blue or super orange. If that ever does happen, you can come in here and change these to kind of color correct to bring those colors out. Also, if you ever come in here and you're like, everything's too green, so you can see that I've got a lot of greens in here, you can color correct closer toward the magenta to correct for that, or vice versa. We can also change the overall tone of our image through the exposure. So if I need to add a little bit more light, take a little light away, we can do this here. Same with contrast. We can add more or completely get rid of our contrast. We'll add a little bit more. Same with highlights. Should you need any more highlights, you can just use the slider and it will add more to your white values. Same with your shadow values, your white value, and your black value. So you can see how that works. And then there's also a saturation here. There's saturation a couple of times inside of the Lumetri settings. And they do all build on each other. So if I were to turn this one up, it would actually increase even further if I were to take another one and add it to it as well. So I'm going to minimize this one here, toggle it off and on so we can see the before and after. Next is the creative section. How this works is when we have our standard adjustments here. So you can add like a faded look to the film, make it a little bit more fuzzy. You can add some sharpen if it's a little bit blurred. You can add some vibrance, which adds a bit more realistic color. Here's another saturation. So if I were to take the saturation that's in the basic correction, I could also add to the saturation here to get even more saturation. You can also tint both your shadows and your highlights to be a specific color. This can help, especially if you have accidentally filmed something and it came out as super orange or blue. You can fix that tint here. But there's also this look. We'll go a little bit further into looks in a little bit, but they're pretty much, you can pick what your camera or filter that you want to use. So if I know I want to use like this, let's do gold tobacco. If I click on that, it'll add an overall filter to this film that would have that effect. That's the creative section. I turn that one off and on. It's nice and subtle. Then there's the curves. This is the exact same curves as what we would use inside of Photoshop. We can also find the curves down here under Effects, RGB curves. By itself, it's in the obsolete section. They're really trying to force people into using Lumetri. But it works just as how you would think. You can use these curves to higher or lower, or raise or lower your curves based off of where you've put your curve. You can do individual channels. So if I'm like, that's a lot of green in here, I can come in here and remove some of that green, really blow into the green, keep some of it, go into the red, remove any red I might have, maybe lean into the blue a little bit more. We also have our hue and versus saturation. So if you want more hue, you can move it on this slider or less saturation. So the higher you go, the more saturation. Lower you go, less saturation. More in one direction. You can see we're changing the colors a little bit. It works same way as a curve editor. We also have a hue versus luma, which is your overall lighting or your alpha channel, luma versus saturation, and saturation versus saturation. So I'm going to minimize this curved section. Then we go to color wheels and matching. This is pretty much the same kind of thing, except it's in a different format. So we have our midtones, our shadows, and our highlights. We can say, hey, I want my shadows to be a bit more to the red or yellow side. So if I turn these up and down, you'll see I get some color change in here. I want my midtones to be closer to the blue. You'll see my midtones change a bit more blue. And if I want my shadows to be a bit more green, my shadows become a little bit more green. I change my shadows to be a little bit more blue, midtones to be a little bit more purple, and I'm going to leave my highlights as yellow. Now there is also face detection. It won't really do too terribly much, but there's also a comparison view, so you can see kind of like what it was before and what it is now. You can also create a part in here and apply a match to anything to make them match. Then we have our HLS, hue, saturation, and lightness, secondary. This is just more color correction, just even more color. So you can set a color and be like, I want red. You can really crunch some of these colors in here. Really crunch some of the lightness in here and the saturation. And it works off of different channels based on how you move these sliders. We also have our refine here. So if for whatever reason you are having an issue with some noise, you can add a little bit more of this denoiser and it will pull some of this out. We will be talking about denoise later when we talk a little bit more about editing footage itself. But just be aware it's here. There's also a little bit of blur. So if you needed to blur anything, you can blur it. Turn that off. And then there's more temperature, tint, contrasting here. So if you need to add a little bit more contrast, if you need to sharpen or bring out a little bit of that sharpen down here. And then there's another saturation on top of all the other ones that we've already looked at. And then the last section in here is the vignette. Do you want to have a vignette? Do you want it to be white or black? Where do you want your center point to be? How round do you want it? And how much feather do you want? Any questions at all about color correction? Anyone at all? Awesome, thumbs up. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to come back over here to my project settings. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this timeline. Don't want that sequence. And let's go ahead and look at the stabilized video right here. So let's say you go out and you shoot some video and you're like, man, this video is awesome, but it's real shaky at some points. There's two things you can do. You can either try to stabilize it using what we're about to do or reshoot. I mean, you could use it too, but who wants to use super shaky footage? So here's an example of what I mean by super shaky footage. I'm going to hit play. So it's not too bad, right? It's a little shaky. It's a little side to side wobble. You can tell someone's holding it by hand and walking backwards. Overall, it's not bad. Would you want to refilm this? Possibly. But I would definitely say we can definitely stabilize it. So let's take a look at the stabilizer tools. So if we come over here to effects again, if we type in stabilize, we have this warp stabilizer here. I'm going to drag that onto our footage, and it'll do two things. It'll run its own calculations and be like, hey, this is what I think you need. It'll tell you exactly how long it's going to take. So currently we're at 22%. If you've got a lot of footage or a really long clip that you want to use, sometimes it's good to turn this on, especially if you think it might need a lot of analyzation. Go find a coffee and then come back and it should be good. We're at about 50%. So it shouldn't take much longer, about 30 seconds. Now, if at any point you did need to cancel, there is a cancel button. But what this does is it runs a whole bunch of different calculations on your footage based off of certain points and different types of methods it thinks you need to run, different calculations. Getting there, for 99%, stabilizing. Okay, we are now stable. I'm going to go back to my editing just so I have more footage here to show you. So if I hit play on this now, it'll actually look pretty good, but if you watch this statue here in the center, you'll be able to see some weirdness kind of happening to it. So this part looks pretty good. Did pretty well. But if you look here, the statue starts to bend and twist. So if we needed for this clip, if all we needed for this clip is just this beginning part, this zoom out to about here, this would be a really nice stabilization. We could give it a little cut, be like, yeah, this looks good. Let's switch to another piece of footage. But it's not. We want to use this whole clip. So there's a couple of other things that we can do. So first off is our result here. It says smooth motion. You can turn this off. It'll recalculate. And what it'll do is it will stabilize in this overall size here. And you'll notice, I think it'll start to shake a little bit. There we go. So we're getting that stabilization, but it's all inside of here. It's not zooming in or changing anything to make it give the appearance that we might need. There's also a smoothness meter here that you can change. It starts it off at default 50. You can also change this to go up, high, raise it or lower it, depending on if you need more smoothness to your footage or not. We also have different methods, so different math types that it runs, different calculations. The default is subspace warp, but there's also position, scale, rotation, and perspective. So position, let it think, just does the position. It doesn't stabilize the overall rotation, so you'll still get that shape, but overall it'll feel a little bit nicer than the original. Looks a lot nicer, still shaky, but definitely not bad. We've then got our position, scale, and rotation. So far it's looking pretty good. We've got some wobbliness here toward the end, some warping. We've also got perspective, so it'll shift things in all three plus perspective. So you'll get some weirdness kind of happening here, kind of stretching. So for right now, I'm going to go back to this position, scale, and rotation. And if we click this little box called preserve scale, what it'll do is it'll try to preserve the scale of your footage for you. So you'll get a lot more wobbly footage. But it'll try to preserve that scale for you. So you'll still get some jumps, but if your footage isn't as bad and you don't need as much inside the scale, it might help. So I'm going to go back to subspace warp. Then we have our border type. So not only is it calculating the overall stabilization method, but it's also calculating your borders. So currently it's doing the framing. So it's stabilizing, cropping, and auto scaling your footage for you. That way you don't have to go back through and automatically scale it. But we can do stabilize only. So it'll just stabilize the footage. So that looks pretty decent, other than the fact there's this border here. These still kind of wobble, but it's not near as noticeable. We can do stabilize and crop. So it'll crop them inside the stabilization. Get some wonkiness in here. Then we have stabilize, crop, and auto scale. This is the one that automatically defaults to. So this is what the original would have looked like when we first tried it. And then there's also the stabilize, synthesize edges. What it does is it tries to figure out how the edges would continue, and it takes a little bit longer to stabilize through. Let's see if it will play. No. What we'll have to do is sequence render into out. So I'm not going to worry about this one quite yet, but I'm going to go back to stabilize and crop, and I'm going to change my method here just to position. And just with this one, even though it's still shaky, it feels a lot nicer. We're still getting some wobbliness in here, but it's definitely better than the original. Then if we go to position, scale, rotation with that stabilized crop, we get a pretty nice result. It's still wobbly. We still get some wobbliness in here, but it's nowhere near as bad. And it's starting to look quite nice. So with a couple of extra scaling attributes in here, maybe some extra smoothing, we'd probably end up with a really nice result. Now there's also this advanced section. It can do a detailed pass. So it'll do another background check on your footage. Takes a little bit longer than the first time through. But it has more options to use in here to try to get the best result you can. Now, when in doubt, if you go to watch your footage back and you're like, man, that's really wobbly or it's really shaky, I don't know if I'm going to be able to salvage it with this at all, I highly recommend just refilming. It'll save you a lot of time. This is very tedious. It is a lot faster just to go back out and film if it's possible, if conditions allow it. 20 seconds left, 78%. But is this making sense to everyone? Awesome, good thumbs ups. Stabilizing. And if I hit play, I get some jitter in here. But overall, it's slowly getting better. It does take a little bit of time to really push the buttons and get things to do the correct amount that you need. So now that I have this, I could come back over here, stabilize, crop, auto scale, go back to subspace warp, see how it changes our original version through now that we have the advanced analysis. Still some wonkiness, but definitely much better. Almost fully salvaged. Any other questions just about this in general, about color correction, about stabilization, anything like that? Okay, so this lecture was really quick. I wanted to make sure I saved you guys some time. That way, if you did want to go outside and film, today is a nice day. It's not rainy. Definitely remember that your 5x5 is due next class, not Friday, but Monday. And does anyone have questions about what's due for that? If not, y'all are free to go. Alec will look at your stuff, double check your camera's quality. I think it's going to be okay though. But other than that, y'all can leave. I'll see you guys on Monday. If you guys have questions, I'll be available on Friday, and I'll be in here for a little bit longer today.